minutes past 9 a.m. and often we hear messaging coming through regarding the environment. And we've seen environmental activists, we've seen many groups, we've seen organizations always promoting the environment. And sometimes we tend to take these messages lightly until disaster strikes. And this is exactly what has happened with UPL, United Phosphorus Limited. And this is north of Durban, where chemicals at the warehouse had gone up in smoke, and thereafter water was used to put out the blaze, but it ran off into nearby water channels, and it has caused huge environmental damage, and at the same time, it's affected. Or the water quality, it's resulted in fish being affected, vegetation, plants, and the like. And this morning, we joined on the line by the MD of Khweza Environmental Consulting, Nazeer Jamal. Nazeer, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Jumma Mubarak, and wonderful that you are able to join us this morning.
Alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jumma barak to you too, and shukran for having me on.
Yes, Nadir. Now, obviously, this UPL, and I covered it briefly, I think, last week when the news obviously had broken, or was it 2 weeks ago? But clearly,
Yeah.
at this point in time, the point I had made earlier on is sometimes we treat the environment very lightly until disaster strikes. And like we see in the case of UPL, we are looking at quite a disastrous situation that has evolved.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, I've been working on emergency incidents like this from about 2010, and it doesn't get easier. The damages are always taken years that you see until recovery, or if even a form of recovery that occurs, and it's always that last minute decision that should have been made but didn't get made, and then disaster strikes, and then they think back and say, well, we should have done this or we should have done that. And there's in any of these cases there's always fingers to be pointed, but at the end of the day it's responsibility of the various stakeholders, the responsibility of the facilities, responsibility of government, responsibility of social society, all of us to definitely have a place to play when it comes to emergencies like these, specifically environmental disasters, because the impact is never just over a day or two or three. It's felt over years and possibly decades.
Well, certainly. And also, I think what is important to understand is what has actually happened. And we know at some point in time, news, obviously, the company was a bit cagey. And have we got now more information and to provide clarity, Nazir, as to what had actually happened, the type of chemicals that have basically resulted in the disaster that we're talking about?
Yeah, so I mean, look, information is still somewhat scarce, and there's lots of hearsay, and this person said that, and so on. So the investigation still goes on from government side. From what we know right now, this is a facility that is a company that's it's an international company based in India that stores majority of its materials to be fertilizer in forms of pesticide, fertilizer, and generally man-made chemical fertilizer. So these fertilizers are extremely hazardous. They're extremely flammable. Most of them, I mean, there's over, I think, there's about 6 or 7 thousand different types of chemicals that potentially were stored on the site. And so it's definitely a chemical storage facility. They're not manufacturing this, but they're more storaging. So it's a processing facility. As it gets into the country, it then gets spread out to its various customers. So the potential for danger should always have been there. I mean, in terms of safety, health, and environment, and especially quality, you're considering this as something that should have been known as a major hazardous site. But what has happened is during the looting, when the fire occurred, it spread through this factory, and because you had flammable materials, the fire spread immediately quick. And at the time that the firefighters had got to site, they weren't fully aware of what was inside the facility, and so even their safety was a concern. But once they got the fire switched out, the common reality when it comes to firefighting is that the water would then enter. I mean, the water that's used to push off the fire would have entered into a stormwater drain. That stormwater drain would have entered into a nearby river, And that river would have led up to the estuaries, and just like this, it ended up down in the northern coast estuaries and ended up into the ocean, where we see major environmental catastrophes occurred. People just seeing the color of the water is not one thing. When you're seeing dead fish lining up, either 300-400 dead fish. I mean, I did my environmental studies at the Isipingo estuary, my thesis, and exactly it was that. You'd see belly up fish just floating out from the river into the ocean because of the amount of pollution that's there. So the chemical oxygen demand increases in the water, and that means that the oxygen required for the fish to survive is too little. And so you'd get major amount of nutrient damage, and you'd see that these fish would be dying, the water would be colored in a different way, and so on. And so that's what happened in the situation.
Now, obviously, Nazeer, we've seen reports come through with regard to the damage and the assessment of the damage, to the extent that some are saying that the ecosystem has been devastated far greater than what was expected. And also some are saying that it's going to take years for a recovery. Just how badly has the environment, we're talking about fish, we're talking about plant life, that have obviously suffered damage as a result of this development?
So we're still waiting again for some of the actual scientific reports by the appointed officials and as well as the scientists that are on this case. But from what I can understand from the experience of many of these, the first thing was obviously the air pollution that occurred on the day of the fire. I mean, these are chemicals that are burning, and the amount of smog and smoke. I remember I'm living in Overport, and this is like easily about, say, 10, 15 kilometers away from the site, and we could smell it, that kind of burning, spicy sensation in your nose for at least 2 days after that fire. So, the impact of just the air issues alone would have been devastating. I know some of the bird watchers up in the northern coast.
I think we have lost Nazeer for some reason or the other. We're going to try and get hold of Nazeer once again. And just looking at some of the comments that have been coming through, the DA councillor at Tekwini saying that the extent to which the ecosystem was devastated seemed far greater than what they'd expected. We see Greenpeace Africa talking about this. Desiree Levin saying
Hello?
that it's going to take 5 years as a fair estimate for recovery. Sorry, Nazeer, we lost you there for a minute or two.
Okay.
You
Yeah.
can continue.
So yeah, the air is one thing. Then we talk about what entered into the stormwater system and then later into the rivers and the oceans were this mix of chemicals. Now, obviously, water quality assessments would have helped us identify. So once those results come, they'd be easily identifiable to see what had entered into the river. Now, this doesn't just happen over. It may have got washed out as we had a few bouts of rain and so on. But what happens is the impact had its immediate impact onto the ecosystem. But then you see that it starts leaching into the groundwater. It reaches into the soil. So you've got major amounts of river banks that potentially are polluted that need to be cleared. All the fish that have been dying in the edges, animals were eating them, so we have to remove all the fish. Again, when we speak about the ecosystem, it's just not about that water resource. It's about the consumers of the water resources, subsequent downstream of that. Then we go to the marine environment, and we've seen, again, huge amounts of crayfish and various other species, shellfish species that have just washed on the oceans because they were trying to get some oxygen back into their system and they couldn't find it. So, we see this with pollution incidents that over a long period of time can it only recover. And this means that the companies and the people responsible would have to ensure that they use their funds correctly in trying and re-establishing those ecosystems that may have been damaged.
Yes. Now, obviously, we've seen a lot of interest in this, and we've seen organizations like Greenpeace Africa. We see Groundwork, Friends of the Earth South Africa. We've seen the Sibaya Conservation Trust, the Hawan Conservation Trust, and many other environmental organizations that have taken a keen interest in what has happened. And I'm sure that with the involvement of environmental activists, a lot of pressure is going to be put on the powers that be to make sure that at the end of the day there is going to be full accountability for what has happened, Nazeer.
Yeah, I mean, there's this interesting legal case that's on right now with the question being asked, did the actual facility require an environmental impact assessment and potential environmental authorization, as well as a major, be registered as an MHI, a major hazardous installation? Now, these are the questions that the legal entities are questioning, and the company has presented, well, they haven't shown the actual legal response that they've got from their lawyers. But apparently there is a legal response that they've received from their own lawyers saying that they did not require any environmental authorization. But we know as scientists that if you're storing more than 80 cubes or more of any hazardous substance, as it's known, or hazardous material, that is known as you that require an environmental permit. Just like a fuel station, for example, is storing maybe 24,000 liter tanks, maybe 4 of those. If it's above 80 cubes in its size, it would require an authorization. So the question would be still, did it require an authorization and did it require an environmental permit? Now, this is the first question that the government will have to answer and the facility will have to represent themselves. The second question is, should it be registered as an MHI? Now, we know of other facilities and other companies that store fertilizer. They're known as MHIs, major hazardous installations. And that would require the facility to have supersede its own current safety regulations itself and standards. And so that's the next question was, should it have? And that's the legal departments are all fighting between themselves. So, they're saying, the company is saying, well, yeah, okay, we'll consider whether we require permits or not. Let us get now into the fact of what's going on and how we can resolve this matter right now. So, I mean, these are questions we have to ask. And I think that's what the activists are questioning is, did the company, are they being ethical in this? And this is, questions answers we don't have right now. But then we have to consider the impact on human life, on environmental life, and definitely on the future of our already polluted resources in the country.
Well, certainly, Nazeer. And just finally, we've seen a comment come through from Groundwork and talking about a worst case scenario that could result in potential human health impacts, and some possibly even associated with potent cancers in what they called persistent organic pollutants.
Yeah, yeah. So we see these persistent organic pollutions come up because they are man-made chemicals, and so the reality is that these don't break down. They're not biodegradable and natural. I mean, people would say fertilizer to an extent. These are naturally biodegradable. They'll dissolve within the water system. But when it comes to issues like this, and you have the dust that settles from the air pollution landing over masses of land. And if I could smell it all the way in Overport, you'd know the impact is great then, spreading across the country, the province. And so the question that we always ask is then, where to from here? What can be done right now? And those specific chemicals have to be found. Where did it land up in? And a real research has to be done across the entire span of all the rivers that the water had gone into. I mean, I know I used to work for the municipality, and whenever there would be a pollution incident, we had to open up manholes to follow where that water, following into which stormwater drain did it enter into a river, follow where that river goes down, and then do assessments as a river goes down, so that we have a better idea of what the actual impact is. And that's why the unknown right now is really scary to know what kind of impact that could have happened.
Well, Nazeer, we certainly will follow developments in this particular matter, but for now, we thank you. We say Jazakallah to you for your time, as always, with us here on Salam Media. We wish you all the best, inshallah. Have yourself a wonderful Jummah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Shukran.
Nazeer Jamal, MD of Khweza Environmental Consulting, with us this morning, which brings us straight on to 9:33 a.m. We come back and we're going to ask this question: how objective is mainstream media in covering global developments? And classic case is the return of the Taliban to power.